I'm pleased to say I'm joined now by Matthew Torbitts, former Labour advisor. And when he came into the studio, he's hobbling around on crutches because he's had a football accident. He's too old for such things. I gave him a sort of introduction, a sort of roaring, clapping introduction. The only sane man on the left. Because you are, it seems.
Well, it's nice to know, I suppose. I just think I just say what I think. I think, you know, it's maddening to me that some people don't see it, but I think what you get, particularly, we were talking about actually, me and another sort of former Labour person last week, and we were talking about the trans ruling. And I say, I think the problem Labour and the SNP as well, sort of fluffy liberal types, have had is they don't want to be seen as mean or nasty, and you can sort of see it a little bit in what Labour are doing in government. They're trying to please everybody, and what you're doing is you manage to annoy everybody.
Do you reckon they don't want to be seen as mean or nasty? Because when they think they're coating themselves in moral rectitude and being part of the trendy latest, you know, newfangled ideology, they don't care about how unpleasant they are to those people who stand up for common sense. I would say they're outright bullies, and the problem is they've been caught rather exposed. We have a little montage here, I believe, of all the times that Sir Keir Starmer and his cohorts were unable to actually point out what a woman is.
Let's not leave out of account that there is a small minority of individuals who were born in a gender they don't now identify with. Some go through a process, others don't, and that is very traumatic.
And I think if we're able to have that debate in a constructive way, actually we'll be able to come to the consensus. Transgender women's rights are women's rights, and it is our women's movement collectively that can have the solution to that and can work with each other to it.
Is it transphobic to say only women have a cervix?
Well, it is something that shouldn't be said. It is not right.
Oh, it's not right to say that a woman's a woman. Never mind, us pesky females got the vote. We didn't deserve that. We shouldn't be in the workplace. Now we're not even allowed to have a wee without some hairy man with dangling gonads sitting next door, listening to the tinkle and getting turned on by it. Brilliant. Well, actually, that is no longer the case, it seems, because Bridget Phillips and when asked turned around and said now everybody has to use the bathrooms of their biological sex. Now, my worry here, Matthew, and I hadn't thought of this before. I did an unnamed programme on Her Majesty's BBC earlier, and they were speaking to a trans barrister who said, well, the only solution in all the cases that I'm going to be fighting is going to be for all bathroom facilities to be unisex. And I thought, oh my God, that's a disaster.
It was my concern. I think, you know, the thing I'd agree with the Prime Minister is it provides clarity. Everyone has said that. It's obviously provided clarity. The advice...
What, that women can't have a dick?
Basically, no, but this is the thing. It doesn't really change anything other than solidify what was always the case. The advice I gave to Labour MPs up until me leaving after the election, because there was lots of MPs worried about how to handle this sort of question, women in the constituency who were on the side of, I suppose, women campaigners and the female campaigners that took the case to the Supreme Court. And then how that might make trans people feel. And I said, as far as I can see, and it seems that's what's the case from the ruling, is the Equality Act says that women should be allowed women-only spaces, female-only spaces, and if it be a refuge, a charity, a changing room, a gym or whatever, isn't doing that, then they are breaking the law, they're breaking the Equality Act. So I think you're covered in the sense of the legislation says that's how it is. And then we should be looking at people that aren't doing that. And they were all still very fearful. But I think it's given grey areas in other ways. That obviously the Supreme Court were quite keen to ensure that, you know, trans people also don't face discrimination in other areas, which I think is right. We shouldn't be discriminating against people, I suppose, you know, and try and be as fair as possible. And I was on another show myself, and there's some on the internet that seems to think I'm making this up, and I don't do things like that. I have a friend who is a trans man, is on transition. I didn't know they were...
When people say trans, are we talking about a woman who's become a man? Right.
I didn't know, because it was clearly such a good transition, I think. I didn't know they were trans for 2 years. I'd met them through a mutual friend. And now he looks like me. Pretty tall fella, bit shorter than me, beard, the whole lot. And it convinced me to the point I didn't know. And I thought, well, if the gender recognition certificate doesn't allow you legally and biologically to be a woman, as the ruling says, would he therefore have to go and change in the women's changing rooms or the toilets? I don't know.
But this is the thing, right, Matthew, because when we talk about the whole trans debate, we never talk about women who have become men. The focus is always on Dirty Henry wanting to go and sleep in the brownie tent. And you know what? In life, it ain't fair. Now, I'm agreeing with you that we need to be compassionate. No one should be persecuting, judging, blaming, being unpleasant to trans people. But do you know what? You've gone through enough in life. You should have some iota of common sense and compassion that perhaps, just in the same way that I don't get to be a Premiership footballer, not that I'd want to be, they don't get to go and sleep in the girls' tent or use the women's changing rooms. And when it comes to bathroom facilities, to me there was an easy solution years ago, which is either where there's a disabled toilet, use it, because they tend to be unisex, and actually normally the disabled toilet is near the women's bathrooms because it's kind of considered to be probably a little bit more sanitary and nice and a bit safe around that neck of the woods. Or you just create a unisex toilet. You have your women's toilets, your men's toilets, and a unisex toilet. And I think most people can use practical common sense. In fact, talking about your mate, who's a woman who's transitioned to become a man, it'd be interesting to know what their life has been like up until this became a heated debate, because I think most people were able to apply pragmatism. For my opinion, it's only when mad leftists and perverts decided they wanted to take as much opportunity as possible to get into women's spaces that we had to do something about this.
I think there's a few things. I wonder how we got to this point, because, you know, Hayley Cropper in Corrie was never a controversy. She was obviously played by a woman, but the idea of a transvestite, as it was known then, was sort of like people like a lovely character people liked.
Right.
And what I think it is every group, unfortunately, regardless of who they represent, have an extreme minority who shout the loudest, maybe don't even belong to that group, people feeling offended on behalf of trans people. Majority of women I know and the majority of trans people I know just want to go about their lives. They don't. My friend said the biggest thing for him was healthcare, the access to healthcare for trans people. You're waiting 7-8 years. That was his priority, not going in the right or wrong toilet.
This is the thing. Everybody loved a drag act until they wanted to come and read Bar Black Sheep to your 5-year-old with a giant plastic phallus. That's my point. It sort of went down. We don't talk about it enough. It went down this route of hypersexualization and, frankly, perversion. And there were men there who were essentially laughing in women's faces with a beard, with the dress, with the lipstick, going, look at my boobs, ha ha. You know, isn't it wonderful? I'm a little girl now. And it was just all rather tasteless and quite disturbing, if you're a woman, to have someone like that say, I'm coming after your toilets. This is my problem. There was no dignity, and the people who were pushing so hard to have all these rights and privileges, and again, I'm going to bring something up that people seem to have magically forgotten or was never reported on. I remember when there was a protest outside the European Parliament all about this, and actually most of the legislation on the trans thing has come from the ECHR, separate to the EU Parliament, but, you know, same sort of ballpark. The activists outside the European Parliament had bottles, plastic bottles full of their pee, and were throwing it about the place. The problem is the movement got hijacked by autogynephiles, weirdos, people with extreme fetishes who thought we can get away with everything. And there were people on the sidelines cheering them on. And no one stopped and said, apart from a few individuals, what about the kids?
I'm all for freedom of speech, I'm all for freedom of protest. There's a way to go about things, and I think rights are hard won through, yes, protest, but through debate, conversation, bringing together different experiences and whatever else. I think the SNP have got a lot to answer for here, and I hasten to say it because, you know, can you put it at one person's door? I think it comes back to common sense, because you think back to, was it Isla Price, the name of the male rapist who decided upon conviction he was a woman? 99% of people can see a blagger when they know one.
Yeah.
The SNP then decided, Nicola Sturgeon basically put her career on it and resigned 2 weeks later from burnout because she was so desperate to appease and, again, not be seen as nasty to groups that are persecuted, or she may see it as, to put a male rapist in a female prison. And I think this is where it really began to take off, because women had had enough and gone, this is now utterly ridiculous. Yeah. If he'd have gone, for 2 years in that sort of body, or, you know, this idea, there was a long run up to it, I could maybe understand to an extent. I'd still be concerned about putting a rapist in with women. You know, there's conversations to be had. And I just think it's sad that such a small percentage of the population, you're talking 0.5% of people, had 6,000 headlines about them last year. And why is this being used? And that's why I think for certain politicians or certain people, trans people are the next sort of scapegoat in which people can blame.
But this is it. I blame some of these fetishy males for actually being the ones who have endangered people with genuine gender dysphoria, who are trying to live in the opposite gender and just get on with their lives and don't want the focus on them. They would rather not be paraded about as a test case. They'd rather just be able to, you know, slip unnoticed in society, have their friends, have their family and have their jobs. And it's all those people who are the blaggers and the perverts, quite frankly, who have made it miserable for everybody. That's my concern. And what I think is so dangerous in the whole of this debate is the normalisation, that's probably not the word I'm looking for, the promotion, actually, the rabid promotion of what is actually a very difficult, incredibly complicated psychological disorder, gender dysphoria, that affects not many people, but when they are suffering from that, they need to be treated with compassion. The problem is kids were being told, oh, you want to be a boy if you're a girl? Go on, use pronouns, change your name. And I thought to myself, this is a psychological condition. It's not sort of, you know, extreme for me to say that. It is. It would be a bit like back in the 90s with the sort of anorexia crisis, adults saying, oh, you think you're too fat? You probably are. How about getting a gastric band fitted? So many kids have been told that, no, this isn't a medical condition. This is cool. This is cool. And that has been so dangerous, it's created a mental health crisis. And
I have heard, you know, despite having a couple of friends that are trans, the other side of people that have either undergone or nearly undergone and gone, actually, no, this isn't what I am, and maybe we're maybe influenced, or I think you listen to people around you at the time who maybe encourage. And I think a lot of it, just comes down to people not quite being able to understand it. I think when gay people were probably fighting for rights, you can almost understand it because we all know what it feels like to be in love. Maybe not with the same sex, but we all know what it feels like. It's a lovely thing. It's a nice thing to try and grab hold of. I can't understand, try to understand, I can't understand what it must feel like to think or believe you are in the wrong body, because I know I am who I am. On the influence, I think schools have to be careful. When you're teaching stuff that isn't really respecting biology, and we're saying boys could have periods and stuff, we're getting a bit silly, and 72 genders, I think that's a bit silly.
You know, as a kid, right, so we're going to have to move on to the migrant crisis, but I just want to say this, as a kid, I grew up with an older brother, 16 months older than me, and we used to climb trees, scrape knees, ride our bicycles. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. I was desperate to be a fighter pilot. I went through periods where I just wore what is so blimmin' scary. You can't have kids being tomboys or boys who might just have an effeminate side. Instead, it's being medicalised and promoted, almost actively encouraged. Even if you don't have gender dysphoria, you probably do. And I just think it's that there's so much undoing to be done from this mess. Let's talk about the Migrant Crime League tables. I do applaud Yvette Cooper saying, right, we need to be transparent. We need to publish this information. People have been crying out for it for a long time. That's all very well. We'd love to see these statistics. I wonder, one of my listeners messaged in saying, considering whenever we read about, you know, people who clearly aren't from this country committing a crime, it's, you know, a male aged 25 from Southampton. You're like, is he though? You know, how accurate these are going to be. But it's going to leave Yvette Cooper with a lot to do when we suddenly turn around and see that a huge amount of specifically our organised crime is being done by foreigners who have come to this country with the express purpose of essentially pillaging it. She's going to have to get on and deport them.
This is the thing. It's interesting what Labour are doing on this, because it's been called for by Robert Jenrick for some time. Nigel and Reform have also been doing it. And to me, it feels like Reform are parking their tanks on Labour's lawn, and Yvette's knocking on the tank door saying, can I get in, Nigel? If you are willing to take the fight to Reform, you're giving them what they want, first of all. And I don't know whether this is to sort of Labour thinking they can out-reform Reform, or go, we really are being tough. The bigger question for me is, if, as the Telegraph and others will say, it's likely to be Albania, Poland or Romania in the top 3 as such in this league table of the crimes that are committed per capita. Fine. What are we doing about it then? There are 20,000 people in this list. If you get over 12 months, you should be up for automatic deportation. But it's not very automatic if there's 20,000 people still here. It's automatic about it. And the other thing is, I don't think it's controversial for me to say, until recently, having lived in London for 6 years, what is your strategy therefore for what is clearly a Albanian underworld operating out in the streets of London, particularly in drugs and other things?
Yeah. What
are we doing about that? Where's the Home Office strategy for tackling that, rather than just going, bad this, all these Albanians doing all this, it's terrible, isn't it? What are we doing about it then? People want to feel more confident and safer going around, and if they know people are either being banged up or there is an real automatic deportation, they may well feel safer because of that. It just feels like they're appeasing a little bit of red meat and the optics without really doing much about it.
I think you're going to be right, and I'm pretty sure that these figures are not going to include sex crimes, because that is the powder keg right there. But also, you know, I've got here, this is, I've said it earlier on the show, this is the Organised Crime Index. This is the coolest website, right? Google Organised Crime Index. It's amazing. You get this heat map and you can like click on your country and zoom in, and you get a report on each and every single country in the world on the organised crime environment. And it turns out in the UK, you're absolutely right. The people consolidating the underworld in cannabis, in cocaine, in sex trafficking. We don't talk about that enough. The pop-up brothels around the country. A lot of Ukrainian women nicked on their way to Poland, now probably doing horrible things because they're being sort of run by gang leaders. It is the Albanians as well as Russians, Turkish people. The Kurds are in charge of the people trafficking. The Vietnamese used to do all the cannabis farms. Now it's the Chinese triad, and the Albanians are taking over that as well. This ain't Peaky Blinders. When I read this report, there's not any conversation about British gangs. It seems all the crime going on seems to be by people who've come here with the express interest of doing just that. And it's going to beg the question, what the hell has been going on with our porous borders? Because if this thing exists, and this has existed for a long time, they knew. We don't need to have some sort of league table. They knew that the crime was being done by foreign gangs, and yet they've managed to come in here. We're going to have to get real, and if it does mean typecasting a country and saying we're going to be extremely discriminatory when it comes to who we allow from Albania, yes, if you're a doctor, in you come. I'm afraid if we're not quite sure what your purpose is here, you ain't coming in because your country's blacklisted. I think we're going to have to take measures like that, because at the end of the day, keeping the streets safe is more important than not offending some rando country 700 miles away.
It's interesting that they don't list, you know, sort of British gangs, because I won't go into, I've been around a little bit, especially when younger. There's plenty of Albanians at it out there, plenty of British people as well. And again, the league table stuff, I understand why people are interested. I think if someone mugs me, I think they're, you know, whatever regardless. I don't care where you're from. What I care about is, what is the operational decision that you're going to be making as a Met, as a Home Office, to tackle this sort of stuff? We had things like Operation Trident in the early noughties and late 90s, early noughties, tackling particularly black-on-black violence, and particularly around guns and gang violence with regards to postcode wars and Peckham and elsewhere. Well, quite. What's the strategy? Do we take a Scotland approach of knife crime and treat it as a public health emergency and look at prevention? Scotland did well over 10 years. They're going backwards now, but they did do some very good work, particularly compared to the rest of Europe, I will say. But again, there's no real detail. It just seems to be appeasing, and we've got local elections and a by-election coming up. Someone in Number 10 tells me that we're going to have an immigration reset after May. I wonder why. Probably because they're going to lose hundreds of seats to Reform, and they want to look like they've listened. And it just feels like appeasement rather than action, and that's the disappointing thing.
I mean, this is it. I kind of, I think this one is gesture politics, because I think she's going to be putting an albatross around her neck by publishing this. But I am glad she's doing it. I welcome it. I think it's the right thing to do. I actually, on some level, have a bit more faith in the Labour Party, because I actually think most people, unless you're a really sort of hard left nut job with a short fringe and a placard saying Socialist Workers' Party, I think most people on the left actually don't want to see unbridled immigration and lots of foreign criminals in the country, because it's pure common sense. And I would like to hope, actually, in good faith, that perhaps Yvette Cooper is doing some of these things because it's the right thing to do.
You've got to know who's here, I think, is the big thing for me. My understanding, and I might be wrong, is that the assumption is a lot of these people came here legally when we were still in the EU. So, there's only so much you can do about that. The problem I have with immigration, really, as a broader thing, is we have people at the moment crossing the channel, and we don't know who they are, because I am all for helping, morally and within reason, genuine asylum seekers fleeing persecution. Unfortunately, because there is no sort of safe way, and the 1951 Convention says you cannot claim asylum in any other way, in any other country, unless you are at our shores, meaning they will cross, you've got economic migrants on the coattails of people that may well be fleeing genuinely, we won't know until they get here, and throwing their passports in. What I would love the Labour Party to do is to remodel the 1951 Convention, which was done post-war. We were trying to help people. Post-World War II, wasn't as many refugees. The world's a very different place from 1951. And why are we not allowing people to claim asylum in embassies in their own country? Therefore, we know who they are before they get here. There's none of this throwing the passport in the thing. We know who they are, if they've got a record, and we can decide if we have them or not.
Yeah, we've got to go to break now. But the problem is I see with this, because I hear people talk about the safe routes, is now the qualification for asylum to me, the bar is set so low in terms of you can say, I'm an Iranian and all my friends on Facebook don't like the government, so I'm not safe here. Or you can say I'm gay and I'm not safe here. That, 2/3 of the world outlaw homosexuality. If we suddenly went, right, Britain is going to say that, if you want to claim asylum, go to your local embassy, there'll be queues around the block.
But
I don't know how we're doing it.
I think you have to remodel the idea of asylum, because unfortunately the world's in a mess, and we're going to get to a point, I think, unfortunately, where if people go, well, my country's a mess and it's at war, we're going to have to go, sorry, there's a lot of places like we haven't got the room.
I think we've got to basically say, you're coming illegally, that's it, I don't care, but actually help neighbouring countries carry the burden.